Hello, and welcome to Landscaping Poetry with Mark Turcott. I am Helen Hokinson. I'm a reference librarian at Johnson County Library and one of the planners of our adult writing programs. I will hand it over to Virginia Brackett. She is part of the Kansas City Veterans Writers Team, who is the co-host of this series, and I will turn it over to her.
Thanks, Helen. I'm so delighted to welcome our next discussion and writing leader to our workshop, Mark Turcott. Mark and I have known each other for a rather startling 3 decades now. When I first heard Mark read his poetry in Chicago, I was mesmerized by his booming, deep voice and his passion for his topics. He's actually a rather soft voiced fellow, but his spoken and written delivery are startling in their resonance and ability to carry you along with his words. Raised on North Dakota's Turtle Mountain Chippewa Reservation, Mark is the author of 4 collections, including The Feathered Heart and Exploding Chippewas. His poetry and prose have appeared in Tri-Quarterly Poetry, Kenyon Review, Plowshare, Sentence, the Missouri Review, and other journals, and is included in the first Norton Anthology of Native Nations Poetry. He's been the recipient of awards from the Lannan Foundation and the Wisconsin Arts Board, and he lives in Chicago, where he is senior professional lecturer in the English department at DePaul University. So it's my distinct pleasure to now let all of you get to know him as the poet I so admire. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Virginia. If I could say Ginger, I hope that's okay. You almost knocked me out of my chair when you mentioned 30 years, and you're right. Unfortunately, yeah, you're right. But I'm honored to be able to know that. It's an amazing legacy that we have, and the respect that you've shown me has been much appreciated by me. The reason I'm here today is because of the relationship that you've made with me, and I appreciate it very much. When you got a hold of me out of the blue, I was delighted, and I'm delighted to be here. I have an obligation, a happy obligation, to let everybody know. I hope we have people in the room. My name is Mark Turcott. I'm an enrolled member, proud enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe Anishinaabe people from Turtle Mountain Reservation near Belcourt and Dunseith, North Dakota, which is, this far from the Canadian border, right in the middle of North Dakota. I spent my earliest years there, and then later, obviously, I'm a mixed blood person. Ojibwe on my father's side, feisty Scots-Irish Michigan farm girl on my mother's side. So I also grew up later in central Michigan around the capital city, Lansing. Identity and place are really important for us folks, so I feel like I need to always include that stuff when I introduce myself to a new group. I appreciate you being here. I hope you'll be patient with my not unaccomplished, but my limited abilities with technology. I think I've got it down. I got good lessons from our friend Helen and Ginger and also Joseph, and I appreciate them very much. So part of my rambling is to give you time to adjust yourselves and get your coffee at your elbow or whatever you need to do. And if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you to open up. You have some resources there available to you. And I'd like you to pull up to your screen the 2 poems that I submitted. One is called Battlefield and one is called Go. And I'd like to, just as an icebreaker, read the poem Battlefield to give you a sense of, you've seen what the things look like on paper, on the page. I'll give you a quick sense of what they look like or what they sound like in my head anyway, okay? I'm gonna give you a beat of about 5 seconds and then hope that you've got it open. All right, this is called Battlefield, and it was originally dedicated to my sister, who appears in the poem, Jackie Sue, who we lost in 2015 sort of suddenly and surprisingly. So I haven't read the poem too many times since then, I realized. So Battlefield for Jackie Sue. Back when I used to be Indian, I am standing outside the pool hall with my sister, she strawberry blonde, stale sweat and beer through the open door. A warrior leans on his stick, fingers blue with chalk. Another bends to shoot. His braids brush the green felt, swinging to the beat of the jukebox. We move away. Hank Williams falls again in the back seat of a Cadillac. I look back. A wind off the distant hills lifts my shirt, brings the scent of wounded horses. And that's called Battlefield, and it's for Jackie Sue. And I submitted this poem and the other poem, Go, as examples of, they're actually from a series of 22 poems that I ended up including in my book, Exploding Chippewas. And they're a good sort of sample for this event because they illustrate the thing that I often do. And in this case, I very much did it, which is give myself a prompt. And in this case, my prompt was to set me somewhere in my past to say, back when I used to be Indian. And the whole premise of the idea of used to be, that's kind of confusing for people, but it's about how any of us used to be anything that we think we are or think we were. And especially for Native people, we live in a situation sometimes where the larger dominant culture constantly questions our identities, questions who we think we are, often doesn't accept our own expression of our identities. And then just on personal levels all the time, right? You could ask yourself, am I the man I used to be? Am I the writer that I used to be? Am I the father that I used to be? So it's kind of a universal question, could be applied to anything. So my exercise was to use that line to place myself physically into my memory and ultimately to show myself and maybe my reader that I used to be Indian, now 64 years ago and 50 years ago and 30 years ago. And I also used to be Indian yesterday when it comes down to it. Maybe not the same Indian. And I use the expression Indian in this case, it's sometimes now thought of as derogatory, and probably we ought to be careful about how we throw that word around. But, in my hands, I think it's, I have the authority, the authenticity to use the word. And certainly in my classrooms, we give permission to communicate and before we worry too much about which labels are correct or appropriate. So I basically, if I'm using the word, then you can talk to me about the word, I guess. So if I can get to this idea of landscape, it's, of course, who but Virginia, maybe Virginia wasn't the only person, but I'll give Virginia the credit with this, coming up with this idea of landscape as more than just a background or a vague setting for a poem. And I've been on panels in the past, and I still see them at conferences, place in poetry. What is the role of place in our prose, in our writing? And those are all really legitimate questions. And then landscape is another thing that we should think about. But for me, and Virginia brought this up too, landscape is more than just a physical setting. Landscape is a mood, if we apply the idea to paintings, a landscape is, you could encounter a landscape painting. And so you're supposed to consume that painting in its entirety as a landscape, right? But there are a lot of things that might be in the painting that aren't necessarily, they're not necessarily dependent on the landscape. They could remove themselves from the landscape. So if you'll forgive me while I take a sip of Fresca. I realize I'm out of practice with my talking since, this week that I just had. Anyway, so the idea that landscape is just, a just a physical description that kind of hangs in the background like a curtain, and is not what we're after here. And I noticed from just quickly looking at the work that was shared by a couple of our writers, including Mr. Darling, who, by the way, I had registered and intended to attend his session this morning, and I meant no disrespect by not being there. I just couldn't get in for some reason, so I feel like I really missed out on that, but no respect to Mr. Darling. In both of their writings, I'm realizing that they seem to be, or at least I'm perceiving, the same sort of ideas, which is landscape is a place where it's a setting, it's a physical place, but it's also an opportunity to layer mood, theme, meaning, emotion, feeling, those kind of things onto the landscape, what we think of as a landscape or a setting for a poem. So, for instance, in the case of Battlefield, which I just read, there are moments when it's almost like I'm listing through description. For instance, I'm standing outside the pool hall with my sister, very straight ahead narrative kinds of stuff. And I don't really expect anyone to feel anything particularly from my saying that. I'm just creating an image. And for me, the word image and landscape they share lots of layers together. And so for me, that's an opening. I love image, but beyond image, I love poetic image, which for me means, and I'm certainly not the first person to explore these ideas. So for me, an image is a description of some concrete thing in the world, okay? Like me and my sister standing outside the pool hall. Poetic image would be intruding upon that description with an intellectual idea, an abstract idea, an abstraction. So theoretically, you could say, and I've heard people say this before, a beautiful river flowing through the forest doesn't really need me to describe it. It is a beautiful river flowing through the forest. And I think it's a little arrogant sometimes when we writers, especially we poets, have a tendency to say, well, I'm going to look at the river and interpret its beauty to some potential reader or audience. Maybe it's because I'm heavily influenced as an Ojibwe person, but that seems inappropriate. That seems awfully, like I said, arrogant to make that assumption, to presume that one can do that. For me, also perhaps having something to do with my upbringing among Ojibwe people, I look at it more as if the beauty, the poetry of the world already exists without me. And it is my job then to recognize it, and then to recognize it and then encounter it. So the result of my writing, especially my poetry, is the depiction, the portrayal of my encounter. And then I hope that by sharing my encounter, it might speak to you as someone in my audience or someone who's my reader or listener. So for instance, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird by William Carlos Williams. I forget which it's maybe number 12, where he says the river, I'm going to misquote him. The river must be moving. See, the river is moving. The blackbird must be flying. I think that's how it is. And so there's this idea that, for me then, somewhere in the world, there's a river flowing and there's a blackbird flying. Okay, so the river is flowing, the blackbird is flying. But for the poet then to say must be is the abstract idea connecting the river to the blackbird. So that's the abstraction, the intellectual intrusion that can only happen with the writer, the poet, the person, the entity who encounters these two objects in nature, these two things in nature that exist completely independent of the observer. So the observer turns the image into poetic image by suggesting something else about it, that they are connected. So if the river's flowing, the blackbird must be flying, and it's the must be thing. So that's not what I'm doing. I mean, that's my ultimate goal, but that's not what I'm doing in every moment of a poem. So I continue in this poem, She, Strawberry Blonde, again, a pretty basic description. But it's also suggesting something, since I'm using Indian in the first line. People who've read my poems already kind of know already that I have a native perspective. So throwing in this detail of strawberry blonde sets the character of my sister, apart a little bit. And then I start, getting more gritty graphics, stale sweat and beer through the open door. Again, basic descriptions, but I'm using less sentence-like, less prosy language to get there. And then a warrior leans on his stick, fingers blue with chalk, and now it starts to become almost like a list of objects, of descriptions of things, right? And then another bends to shoot, his braids brush the green felt swinging to the jukebox. So those little details are starting to add some mood, something going on in the image that's sort of independent or outside of the image, like the jukebox, or the idea of swinging to the beat of something, right? And then swinging to the beat of the jukebox, and then we move away. It goes back, the camera lens, the poet's lens goes back to the two people, myself and my sister. And then vaguely, sort of abstractly, Hank Williams falls again in the backseat of a Cadillac, which for me is a reference to the idea that every time you hear a Hank Williams song, that can sort of be what's happening, his sad ending, right? And then I look back, which is just a moment to pause in the poem for me before I head into this kind of metaphysical, poetic image thing, which is a wind off the distant hills lifts my shirt, brings the scent of wounded horses. And I hope, I wouldn't expect you to completely understand what I'm getting at here. It's even tricky for me, but over time, I hope you'll get a sense of what we're doing. If I could, by the way, I would ask Helen, if we seem to be getting some questions from folks that, they need a little bit, tiny bit more clarification or specific kind of question about something, I'll try to keep an eye out for them. But I'd hope that at the end, we'll be able to give folks a time to ask some really specific questions about things before we close things up. In the meantime, I provided another sample, which is I think it's called a resource list, of a poem called Indian Things. If you could take a minute to pull it up and look at it. It's a really good example. It's a really good example of this whole idea of what is landscape and what might not be landscape. And I'll give you a beat of 5 again to get that open if that's working. Okay. I realize I might not have my screen here. I'm making sure that I can see the Q&A box. Okay. Nothing there right now. Okay. So this poem is called Indian Things. And it begins with an epigraph. And I don't know if you are familiar with terms like, there's a lot of cliches out there about Native people and about how Native people operate in the world. So sometimes people have the audacity, at our readings or in interactions with us through Q&As to say things like, after we've presented ourselves as Native people in a reading, they want to know, like, how come you don't write more about eagles or teepees or Mother Earth? Often people will be like, I thought there were going to be some coyote poems. We're never really quite sure what they're looking for. And they'll say, all those Indian things. How come you don't write about Indian things? And I'm like, well, everything I say is about Indian things, for me. So that becomes a point of contention sometimes for some of us. So I decided to take the opportunity one time to address some of those specific ideas and then kind of turn them on their head. So in the first line, this poem is not about praying to circling eagles. This poem is about a soaring poet. So I'm taking the idea of like, okay, if you expect soaring eagles in my poem, then here's your soaring eagle, who is a soaring poet that I know. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and read the whole thing first and then go back and talk about moments of it. And this piece, you might want to keep in mind if you've decided to attend my workshop, where I'm going to ask you to spend a lot of time in the workshop. I think that's a Zoom where we might be able to communicate more freely back and forth. I'm going to ask you to do some imitation of things that are happening in this poem. This poem is not about praying the circling eagles. This poem is about the soaring poet who moves me to my knees, Mick Vranich, hidden in that secret forest deep in the rusty heart of Detroit. He perches in the swaying trees, his long black wings toll the sonic bell of his Fender Stratocaster. His voice like a saw cross-cuts the darkening sky. His voice like a hammer nails and raises the shape of a roof over the wounded flesh of the world. This poem is not about walking with spirits of deer. This poem is about the boy who speaks tongue of birds. My son wanders in the juniper meadow, dew glistening in his singing hair. He calls hawks by secret names. His sharp, shiny eye sees every flicker of tail and grass, feather and sky. His scent, like wine, drunkens the wings of butterflies. He winks at the laughing black salamander, smiles at the snakes who rub soft bellies on his bare feet. This poem is not about the sacred shape of a teepee. This poem is about the fragile house of a man's ancient chest. My father, impatient, stands in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles. He waits to pass one last secret test. His worn, aching heart sputters, throws him to the tiled floor. His gaze fixes on the cold white ceiling light, and he smiles. He imagines he is behind the wheel, driving 1,000 miles to make peace with a distant sun. This poem is not about being born of Mother Earth. This poem is about the woman who first gave blood to my heart. My mother, drifting in a rocking chair within the creaking quiet walls of her room, she counts secrets, days as miracles. Her small, tired fingers stroke blue flowers on her favorite sweater. Her dreams, like holy waters, wash away her muddy memory. She blinks at the snowy television screen where the fuzzy face of Jesus grins at her, forgives her only sin, me, and other Indian things. Now, there's a lot more going on in there, I hope, than merely just descriptions of, my version of a teepee, my version of the soaring eagle, my version of Mother Earth. I hope that by making my images, by creating a landscape within the poem and in the different sections of the poem, that I've suggested some meaning, some emotion for a reader, to feel something, right, beyond just seeing something. So for me, then, if we begin with the first, this first concept, the exercise I'm going to ask you to go toward, the prompt, is this idea of, you will say in your practice, this poem is not about this thing, and you'll make it some concrete thing, and you'll say it's about this, which is just going to be your more fine-tuned look at or portrayal of the general idea. So if the general idea is soaring, circling eagles, I'll say, okay, this poem is not about that thing. This poem is about this, which is really what is more important than circling eagles, if that makes any kind of sense. So I talked about it a little bit already in that first section. In the second section, this is an observation. I haven't pulled this poem out in a while, and I forgot about how lovely it was for me to write this moment about my son. This is many, 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 many years ago when he was in this moment. This poem is not about walking with spirits of deer. This poem is about the boy who speaks tongue of birds. So it's the implication is, Native people, are connected to nature, and there's even rumors that some of us can, shapeshift and turn into deer and elk. And I wish, right? I wish I could, especially when I'm late for my train. Instead, I'm saying, here's the real world Native experience, which is me observing my son as he plays and just interacts with nature, just as a human person, right? So this poem is about the boy who speaks tongue of birds. My son wanders in the juniper meadow, dew glistening in his singing hair. He calls hawks by secret names. So I hope that I'm suggesting that a reader is understanding that all of this stuff that I'm describing is magic. It is strange and metaphysical, and you could even say spiritual, perhaps, but it's more about him being who he is, a person, and less about weird cliches that we've come to understand about someone being native or being, or so-called Native American, So that's what I'm trying to achieve in those moments. And by suggesting things like, what makes it not just a list of descriptions, of concrete things, I add in little abstract things like he calls hawks by secret names. So the idea of, speaking to hawks is one thing, but then I add my own personal element, the detail that makes this personally my poem, which is his idea of secret names. And I don't think that needs to really be explained to the reader, that the reader can kind of get on board with that and kind of hand themselves over to that idea that, oh, what are the secret names? You don't need to know. And I don't even know them. He's the one who knows them, right? His sharp, shiny eye sees every flicker of tail in grass, feather in sky. And that's just a much more interesting, poetic, I think, imagistic way of saying he sees every lizard and every bird, or chipmunk or whatever has a tail in the grass, right? And then, so that lens feeling, it evokes a sense of emotion, maybe, and a little bit of sentiment and romance in there too, I think. And then his scent, like wine, drunkens the wings of butterflies. Doesn't mean that my son's been hitting the bottle. He was probably 7 in this moment, in this poem. But it means, like wine, his natural smell also is capable of intoxicating the nature in a good way that surrounds him. The poor butterflies who fly away a little bit drunken after encountering my son. So he has his effect on the nature as well. And then he winks at the laughing black salamander, smiles at the snakes who rub soft bellies on his bare feet. So their bare bellies on his bare feet. So those adjectives really help for me with the enhancing of the concrete image. So, it's dangerous. It's a dangerous thing to get crazy with adjectives in our poetry. And it's tempting. But then you just end up with everything has a characteristic or a descriptive adjective applied to it. So it then becomes intrusive. So we have to be careful about that. And then just quickly, a couple of the images from the rest of the piece. And I'm sorry, I'm distracted by my time here. I lost track of my time. Let's see. Okay, started at 10:45, right? Boy, I've been talking a lot already. I need to wrap this up a little bit so that you folks have some time for questions. So maybe you could offer some questions that Helen can then pass on. So this poem is not about the sacred shape of a teepee. And this one is very much, like just saying, a teepee is a structure, it's a house, it's a home. Instead of that kind of house and home, this poem is about the fragile house of a man's ancient chest, which then allows me to speak about my father. So, and my father's ancient chest is just as sacred a home as something like a teepee, for me. And I'm Ojibwe, but since we are Northern Plains Ojibwe, we also utilize teepees, much like the Lakota. And then also, my father, forever impatient, stands in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles. And I'm including that line very much on purpose to place the poem in a landscape, in this case, a physical place, a physical landscape that intrudes upon the idea of Native American stuff. Oh, Native Americans stand in line at the DMV and get irritated about it like everybody else. He waits to pass one last secret test. And if you scan this poem again, you'll see that in every one of these sections, something secret is being suggested. And every moment in here, there's a secret that's going on that is not necessarily revealed to the reader. But I think that's enough, that intent of putting the idea of a secret out there is what's really important to the reader more than what is the secret in each case. His worn, aching heart, you have to forgive me, I'm getting a little misty about this. His worn, aching heart sputters, throws him to the tiled floor, which is literally, I was not there to witness it, but I can certainly imagine it was described to me that he had what they call a heart attack while standing in line, and ended up passing away there on the floor of the DMV. And then suggesting his gaze fixes on the cold white ceiling light and he smiles. And then I go ahead and imagine what he might be imagining in his last moments, that he is behind the wheel driving 1,000 miles to make peace with a distant son, who is me. And not with a son who lives far away, but with a distant son, implying not only distant in distance, but also distant because he and I were fairly estranged. So the idea that he was there at the DMV, and this is the truth of it, to get his license renewed so that he could, if he needed to, be prepared to make a trip to come and see me, as part of a reconciliation that we were working on at the time. And then I guess if people are sparked enough to throw some questions my way, I'd be happy to answer them. Helen, if you want to throw them at me. I think I have, let's see, there's a chat. Is that where I should be looking for the, I'm distracted. I get distracted by the chats really quick.
I can read the question to you.
Okay.
Have poetry thrives on suggestions. How might your idea of letting readers know what we're not writing about apply to prose?
Boy, when I was a carpenter, I only stuck to the things that I could carpenter. I never did like trim work, because I left the trim work to the trim workers. But I've done enough prose, so if the prose writers, the masters out there in the world, will forgive me for intruding, I will forgive you if you find occasion to speak in poetic terms. I think the same thing applies. I think everything that I feel about how I write poetry also applies to how I write prose. Of course, I often get accused of writing very poetic prose or very prosy poems. As a matter of fact, in my entire newest manuscript, what would be my newest manuscript, is nothing but prose poems. So they're poems that are in these blocks, justified both sides. So they very much look like this is not a traditional lineated poem. And then that frees me, and in my relationship with a reader, to then they know what they're dealing with. And so I can use the luxury of prose by being narrative and speaking in sentences. And then I can also break the prose with my ideas about poetic imagery, fragment sentences, and things like that. So for me, the key to it is the suggestion, I think was the word in the question, but I also like the word enhance. So there's nothing more elegant than a beautiful description of an oak tree. But there is something that might not be more beautiful, but might be more helpful to me as a human being, is to let me know how the observer of the oak tree feels about it, how the oak tree enhances their experience of the world. If that's the question, yeah. I don't want to end up like taking all of our Q&A time to like ponder one question. So I hope that's okay for now. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to rephrase what you just said, because it was really brilliant. It's the description of the oak tree, but the speaker's experience of the oak tree that we're getting at.
Right.
Is that what you just said?
Sure. I mean, because ultimately, I said earlier in my presentation that the oak tree doesn't need us to describe it.
Yeah.
The oak tree does not. The oak tree is there. It was beautiful before I ever encountered it. It'll be beautiful long after I'm gone. Yeah. So what is the purpose of that? And it's not just me, it's every other person too, right?
Yeah.
We don't
Yeah.
need somebody to describe an oak tree to us. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe some of us do.
Yeah.
But what we need is then, okay, now what does that do to you? What does that oak tree's existence and its beauty do to you?
Yeah. I love it.
Or how does it enhance your experience? So for me, you hope you have abstractions that are enhanced by description. Sometimes you have descriptions that are enhanced in their quality by abstractions. And, it's that old show tell. It's a balancing of showing and telling. So abstraction is telling. Let's say in very general terms, abstraction is telling, and description, making images, is showing.
Yeah.
And the two together in a very beautiful soup is then, in my mind, poetic image.
Yeah.
Okay.
Next question. Do the many layers of meaning that are so beautiful in this poem come from the first draft or fourth or fifth?
Boy, I can't remember last time I had the luxury of doing a fourth or fifth draft of a poem. I usually have to write, even though I'm a university professor and I have summer off. Somehow I still never get around to writing poems until I'm really desperate to do it. I think for me personally, and the only way I can answer that is just my own personal experience, I begin with an image. And then I hope that I've done this enough. I feel like I've been writing poems since I was 5 years old, so some 59 years, and maybe even earlier than that, but sort of aware of writing on purpose since I was 5, that I've got enough practice in so that the first time I describe something, the first time I try to put an image onto a piece of paper, I'm already just automatically working in suggestions of meaning, maybe, to the point where I have to sometimes be careful to not bury, see, that's the danger, bury the image in those possible meanings, because the image is important too. We need time. I sound like I'm being, dismissive of the beauty of an oak tree, but no, go ahead and tell me how beautiful the oak tree is. Give me a second to bask in that, and then enhance it with the meaning. So I guess if it's a matter of getting it down on the page, do the thing that comes natural to you first. And with my students, most of my students are probably not as far along with their poetry journey as, the people in this room. But I just say simple things like, ultimately, don't hinder yourself with concepts. If I say to you, descriptions are more than just lists of things, but writing lists of things is really helpful for you, then write those lists. Start with your list first, then you can fine tune them into better descriptions. And students often, my students often have been told, someone has taught them that lists are descriptive. You need to be more descriptive. So they say, just offer a list of things, the red barn and the black horse and the blue sky and, and they somehow are told that is description, and for your first version, if that's where you need to start, then you go back and you say, okay, the red barn, what about the red barn? Add a little something about the black horse. Is the black horse running? I've done a primitive exercise of my life is like a river. We've all heard that, life is like a river. Okay, this week, what kind of river? Is it like a murky river? Is it like a freezing cold river? Is it like a river full of styrofoam cups from McDonald's? The apple cans, there's all kinds of, there's not just one kind of river, I guess is what I'm getting at. So when you say so if someone's sitting on the bank of a river and the river is murky, that is a suggestion that maybe what is going on in the poet's life is murky, rather than, just your average beautiful river, if that makes sense. I did notice that somebody asked really quickly about the poem. I think they're talking about Indian things. is not in Exploding Chippewas. That book is not or that poem is not in any of my books. It was published a million years ago in Cream City Review. The university, it was, I don't know if it still is, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's literary journal. And we got a couple minutes left?
We've got a couple minutes left, and we've got one more question. And let me pause here to say that if anyone wants a free copy of The Feathered Heart, The Feathered Heart, email me, hokinsonh@jocolibrary.org. It's up in the chat, and I will arrange to send it to a Johnson County library for you to pick up. So putting that out there. And then what would you say to a beginning poet to encourage the prose writer who is attempting to write poetry?
Oh, geez. I guess the things that my prose writing friends said to me when I was trying to cross that bridge, do what you do best. Don't be afraid to bring what you feel confident in, like what is you, the thing that is you in your prose, bring it to your poetry. And the beautiful thing, especially now when we can all just type stuff on some, cyber screen, and we can save it, and then we can save another copy of it and change the heck out of it and still have the old copy of it. We have lots of opportunities to tweak. That's become one of my favorite literary words, is the concept of tweaking, or writerly words, I guess. Everything, don't ever not write something down just because you think, oh, this isn't really, I'm supposed to be writing prose, or I'm supposed to be writing poetry. You might be writing a letter to your grandma. Who cares? It could turn into the best poem you ever wrote. So just apply your best skills, the thing that is mostly, the thing that most represents you as a writer, as an artist, however you want to conceive of yourself. Apply it to your prose, no matter what genre, prose, poetry, playwriting, screenwriting, whatever. Do that first, because it's about getting it down. I'm a firm believer in the idea of not hindering oneself with like preconceived notions about how we should write. But thanks. Those are great questions. That so I suddenly feel like people might have been listening. It's hard without all of, I need your faces. If you have to look at mine, oh my God, it's not fair. I don't look at yours.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. And we hope that everybody will join us shortly at 11:45 for Mark's writing group, where we'll actually get to work on putting some of this advice and discussion on the paper for ourselves.